New videos every day.
Life, wisdom.
I'm Psyche Truth correspondent Karina Rachel. Today on the Truth Talks, we're going to be discussing the insanity defense. So I want you to leave your comment and let me know what you think. Do you agree that there should be an insanity defense so that if you've committed a crime, you can say that you were not of a proper mental state when you committed it and effectively be found not guilty as a result? I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Ross. He's a psychiatrist and author based out of Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, good to be back.
So I want to talk a little bit about the insanity defense and just kind of get a feel for, as a psychiatrist, what is your perspective on the insanity defense?
Well, it's a little different from the average psychiatrist probably. And there's several kind of layers or steps to my thinking. The first is, just as a concept, I don't agree with it. As far as I can see, if you did it, you're guilty. If you didn't do it, you're not guilty. Kind of end of discussion. Mm-hmm. The idea that you did do it, but you're not guilty because of your mental state, to me just doesn't make logical sense. I don't buy the whole concept. And so I think that the whole way that the system is structured needs to be redone. So we should have basically a guilt phase and then a sentencing phase. In the guilt phase of a trial, it really is just, are you guilty or not guilty? Mm-hmm. If you're not guilty, you walk out. If you're guilty, now we have to go to a sentencing phase. And in the sentencing phase, maybe we could have mental health testimony.
Right.
I actually think even there, probably not. And I'll give you my reasons if you like.
Yes, certainly. Because I think that in general, when we think about it, you would say, wow, well, if you were not of right mind, then, you shouldn't be held accountable for something you do. But realistically, I think that I do agree with you that, you either committed a crime, you either did this action or you didn't. And certainly your state of mind when you did or didn't do it shouldn't affect whether you're guilty or not. But yeah, please elaborate on the sentencing.
So there's kind of the theory and then there's the practical reality of it. So at the practical reality level, now we're in the sentencing phase and we're going to allow mental health testimony. So the question is, should the testimony affect the length of incarceration? That's the first question. Or should it only affect the services you get while you're incarcerated? And I would say it shouldn't affect length of sentencing. It should only affect what services you get while you're in jail, mm-hmm. or while you're on probation, or while you're wearing your ankle monitor, or whatever it might be. Okay. Because obviously there's many, many, many people in the criminal justice system who have mental health and addiction problems. That's not a question. The question is, what does the system do about that?
Right.
And as soon as you allow not guilty by reason of insanity, you've got one expert who says the person is insane and one person who says they aren't. One expert always says black, the other expert says white. So they can't all be right. Mm-hmm. So that's the big problem to start with, that we don't have this objective X-ray, here's the broken bone kind of evidence. Right. It's always a matter of perceptions, judgments, and opinions, and there's always an opinion on each side. So that just makes both the law and psychiatry look ridiculous, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So then when we get out of the guilt phase, we're in the sentencing phase. If this can affect the length of incarceration, now you've incentivized the person to act like they're more mentally ill than they are.
Right.
You've incentivized the defense attorney to go and find an expert who will feel sorry for the criminal and say, yes, he's mentally ill and he shouldn't be in jail for so long. Mm-hmm. And you're just back in the same mess.
Right.
So if you took mental health testimony out of the length of sentence, then it would just be, what kind of services does this person need while they're incarcerated? Mm-hmm. Which could make sense. But then the problem is, you're not going to get meaningful mental health services in jail anyway. So what's the point of the whole exercise?
Right.
Because in typical jail, there's like one psychiatrist for 2,000 inmates, mm-hmm. and they all have all kinds of trauma histories, mental health problems, drug and alcohol problems. And so there's just not much reality to the whole thing.
Right. I think that you've brought up a really good point here, which is that on, a case-by-case basis, it would make sense that you would address the mental state of the person. But certainly when we're looking at it in terms of, what is the protocol for all of these thousands of people that, this would apply to, it becomes, as you mentioned, just based on this very, subjective opinion of someone coming in and saying, oh, they were of this mental state or they're not. And again, as you pointed out, you can always find an expert on either side. And especially with this aspect of incentivizing that people would want to be able to claim the insanity defense. It's incentivizing, you could get a shorter sentence if you can find someone that will say you weren't of right mind at the time you committed this crime.
Right. And then I've actually done this once or twice in criminal trials where there's an insanity defense. And another part of the problem is quite often when you interview the person, you're already like 6, 9, 18 months post-crime.
Right.
So now you're sitting in a prison talking to somebody, asking them what their mental state was 18 months ago. There's no way that's going to be very accurate.
Right.
So there's all kinds of practical problems get in the way. Going over to the flip side now. Here's why the insanity defense might make sense. So this is a made-up scenario. So the guy comes into the convenience store. He's brandishing an automatic weapon, 100 clip kind of weapon. He points it at the owner and he demands 2 chocolate bars. So the owner hands over the 2 chocolate bars. Then he puts the weapon down and he demands that the owner call the police because the police need to know that the Martians are really running the mayor's office. And the police show up and arrest the guy. So this guy's obviously not, in fact, a criminal. He obviously is insane. So how should we handle him? It doesn't make sense to treat him exactly like we would treat a typical criminal. Mm-hmm. That's the idea of the insanity defense, which kind of intuitively makes sense.
Right.
The problem is then when we come and implement it, and we don't have a really objective way to say who is and isn't insane, and we can't agree what the definition of insane is, and then you're just back in this mess.
Right.
So it sort of sounds okay and kind of makes intuitive sense in a way, but it just doesn't work in practical reality. That's my view.
And I think you brought up a really great point at the beginning of our discussion, which is that for any crime committed, a person either committed it or they didn't.
Right.
Committed it or they didn't. And so, to then add in this very subjective, argument that they can then claim, this particular psychiatrist is here to vouch for me that I was not of a right state of mind when I did this, and then that would, somehow affect their sentence, really does put us in a situation where, as you mentioned, while on a case-by-case basis, we can kind of understand where that would make sense or why we would want to have that in implementing it, this really is not going to be an effective way. Because ultimately, when we're looking at the legal system, our ultimate goal is, rehabilitation. And so I think that you brought up a great point that while certainly maybe mental health state should be considered when we're just discovering what's going to happen to this person once they're being rehabilitated and what kind of services they're going to receive. But again, I think the argument could be made that, how much of the legal system and especially the prison system, how much can we really rely on that system to effectively rehabilitate criminals in the first place?
Right. And then another wrinkle in the problem is it's got to do with the legal meaning of insanity. So you can be clinically insane, or like the typical common sense idea of being insane, but you're actually legally sane because you know the difference between right and wrong. So there's a big disconnect between the legal definition of insane, which is you don't know right from wrong, and common usage and actual clinical psychiatry usage of you're insane.
Right.
And so that's another problem. And then we end up with, okay, so this guy's a serial rapist or a serial killer, and now we're going to talk about, is he sane or not? How could you be sane and be a serial killer, or not be mentally disturbed and be a serial killer? So in that sense, all serial killers are insane, but they know what they're doing. They don't go turn themselves in. Mm-hmm. They try and evade getting detected.
Right.
So in that sense, they are sane. So you're basically stuck with a problem that the serial killer is both sane and insane, depending on how you're using the word.
Right. And I think that it's also important to return to the idea of the purpose of a legal system and the purpose of, prison time as a result of a guilty sentence, is that people should have to pay for their crimes. And if somebody, as you mentioned, is a serial killer, there should be no defense they can make that would, slight the crimes that they committed. Because clearly, as you pointed out, well, they were coherent enough to commit these crimes. They were coherent enough to get away with it for this measure of time. Clearly there was a certain amount of mental clarity that that person had to be obtaining in order to commit those crimes. I think a great example of the insanity defense is Andrea Yates. And we've actually talked about her case in a previous video,
right,
when we were discussing the role of psychiatric medications. Once people are already on these medications, taking them as prescribed, and then they commit a really horrific crime. And that was really the situation that she was in. We knew that she was already under the care of a psychiatrist and taking medications under that psychiatrist's care. So then for her to be able to claim, that insanity defense and effectively use that defense, what are your thoughts, I guess, on that specific case?
Well, it's a horrible case, obviously, but we're in a conundrum, which is, what is it that caused her to be insane? Was it the illness, or was it the medication? Mm-hmm. Or was it half and half? Or was it neither? Mm-hmm. And then how are we going to figure that out? So you'll get 1,000 psychiatrists come and testify, no, Andrea Yates was insane because of her mental disorder, not because of the medications. Mm-hmm. And then you might be able to find 2 or 3 psychiatrists who would say, no, these are known side effects of these medications according to the FDA. Right. And it's perfectly possible that she was not an irresponsible person. She was taking meds as prescribed, and they had the known side effects that resulted in the behavior. So most psychiatrists wouldn't say that, but it's factually true.
Right.
But then how are you going to know whether really it was the meds that tipped her over or just her illness got worse? And then there's no objective way to decide that. So then you're back to the opposing experts and back in why it doesn't work.
Right. Well, I think that's a really important point to recognize, is that maybe while the insanity defense really does kind of make sense when we think about it, really the crux of the issue lies in how do you implement it?
Exactly.
How do you have any kind of objective proof one way or the other in something that's really very intangible?
I agree.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here. If you've enjoyed this video, I do hope that you will click on that like button. Be sure to leave your comment and let me know your thoughts about the insanity defense, either what you thought before watching this video or what your thoughts are now after hearing our discussion. Please be sure to subscribe to the Psyche Truth channel so you can see all of our future videos, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Cool.